So to kind of wrap up, I think we were chatting about some of these existing examples like Costa Rica and some cities and some places in the United States you'd mentioned that might be good candidates to look at this as an economic development and a workforce development system. We were talking offline about some of the challenges with cities, and the thing that struck me when you were chatting about that is the time, right? If you look at these political cycles, or 4 years, 2 years, whatever, it's like, well, 5 to 10 is like, oh, I'm not going to be in office, and the last thing I want to do is tee up my competitor, right? So the to your point, the incentives and the timing are at odds, right? Just like you described before about the cities, the tax versus the entrepreneur, it's at odds, even though their ultimate goal is the same. The way they're going about it is essentially cannibalizing each other, so neither one of them succeeds. So it's completely backwards. So we can probably all agree to that. So I think part of it is really focusing on some of these incubators, the 500 startups, the Y Combinators, the tech stars, whose business has been for decades, right, essentially building companies. And to the extent they're not aware of this, becomes another awareness campaign, essentially. And as you were speaking about the marketing of this and potentially marketing this as a software as a service licensing model to cities, to other things, and maybe some of these incubators, getting you to the point where you have the infrastructure through your conversation to be able to offer this as a service that you can sell to for subscriptions and things like that today or in the near term. Sounds like something you were speaking to right before we got back on the call. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. And let me just touch on that timeline thing for cities. You're spot on. Cities and national governments are often on a 3 to 5 year cycle. Now, that is easier in parts of the world that have multiple parties, and it's usually a coalition where you then have perhaps a shuffling of who has more or less weight in the coalition, but the 70 to 80% of the people in the coalition are consistently there over a 10 plus year period. There it's
Yes.
easy.
Yes.
But let me narrow down to the specific question. Let's say that a city comes in and works with us to build a Fair Shares Commons ergodic ecosystem in their city, because they are providing the built capital, the manufactured capital of the city. They qualify for city shares in the company. What they will benefit, which is on an annual basis, any dividends that come out. And that could be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. The dividends start being paid immediately, every year. You could look at this somewhat akin to a royalty that gets paid every year on the investment of the city. Secondly, as the company grows in market cap, the city qualifies for newly issued investor shares to some fraction of that growth in market cap. Now, those shares are immediately tradable. So the city could opt, just before the end of a certain cycle, they could opt to sell those shares immediately on a secondary market or on a public market if it's listed. Or they could opt to keep them through to the next cycle. So there is already built in the flexibility that cities need to extract their capital on a much shorter time span than the longest investors would. And this is the power of this approach. Cities can't usually invest in a venture capital fund because it has a very specific timeline that is not at all aligned with the election cycle of a city. Our approach, you have high liquidity from the get-go.
Well, I think this is where that would, to me, from as an investor perspective, kind of going back to the intention behind the call, the cities and those opportunities will probably be second or third phase, right? Today, right? It's how do we get Evolute 6 engaged with companies, organizations, entrepreneurs that are willing to purchase, subscribe,